This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
It's both kind and rational to like knowing animals. You can't deny it's fashionable to like knowing animals.
Hello everyone and welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast in which we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Josh Milburn and I do like knowing animals. This episode is brought to you by the Animal Politics book series from Sydney University Press. Today we're going to be talking about insects, and I note that invertebrates are actually not that well represented in the Animal Politics series. However, it's a topic that would fit in well. If you're currently writing about invertebrates, why don't you reach out to the editorial board? Books in the Animal Politics series are very affordable, which is great news for readers and for authors. Now let me introduce you to today's guest. Dr. Dustin Crummett is an affiliate instructor in the School of Interdisciplinary Arts and Sciences at the University of Washington, Tacoma, and the executive director of the Insect Institute, which is a non-profit organisation that critically explores insects in the food system. Dustin's academic background is in philosophy, but he today writes more broadly than this, contributing to research around various aspects of insect farming, as well as questions concerning animals in ethics and animals in the philosophy of religion. Today we're going to talk about his recent paper, Have the Environmental Benefits of Insect Farming Been Overstated? A Critical Review, which was published open access in Biological Reviews in 2025. Dustin was one of 6 authors on the piece, and the others were Corentin Bertau, Tom Bry-Chevalier, Katrina Lowy, Ren Reiber, and Michael St. Jules. So can you start by telling us what led you to work on this topic?
Yeah, probably some of the same things that have made you interested in this and adjacent topics and in some of your work. So I've been interested in alternative proteins for a long time, questions about whether alternative proteins can help reduce meat consumption, can help improve the food system more broadly. Insects, ever since about 2013, when there was a big UN FAO report kind of celebrating the potential of edible insects. Insects have been kind of widely promoted as part of this package of alternative proteins. And you can see why people have thought that they might have a lot of potential. Okay, lower environmental impact than conventional meat, et cetera, et cetera. At the same time, they're like the most different from the other alternative proteins out of all alternative proteins. One obvious reason for that, this is an animal studies podcast, some listeners will be aware that insects are animals. One set of concerns are like philosophical, ethical concerns about whether they have any moral status or not. It's unclear whether they can feel pain, what sort of treatment of them would be justified or not. In this country, the RSPCA actually has called for a pause in the growth of insect farming because they're concerned that we don't have sufficient welfare science, sufficient safeguards in place, et cetera. But also, some, not all, but some of the issues with inefficiencies, ecological problems that exist in just conventional intensive farming also, it turns out, carry over to attempts to rear insects at a massive scale. And then that, particularly when you realize that the overwhelming majority of farmed insects are not being eaten by humans as food in place of conventional meat, but are instead being used either as pet food or farmed animal feed, that raises questions about the environmental sustainability of insect farming. There's kind of a question of how promising this is relative to other potential alternative proteins once you think about some of the actual realities of the industry right now.
Yeah, and I did want to ask very specifically about those actual realities, because I think lots of listeners will be familiar with many kinds of vertebrate farming, but insect farming might be quite new to them. So could you tell us a bit about the insects that are being farmed and what farming them looks like? And then you've already nodded towards this, but perhaps there's a bit more to be said about where insect farming fits into our economies and food systems.
Yeah. The insects that are farmed most commonly are black soldier flies. So it's a type of tropical fly that you farm larvae Those are the product, and then you need a certain number of adults to breed and produce larvae. So if you go to a farm, and there are small farms that are a couple of shipping containers, there are huge farms that are supposed to produce 100,000 tons of insect meal a year. Most of those are not running at full capacity because the industry is having a lot of financial trouble. But if you go to one, basically, when you go to where the larvae are, they're just trays stacked up, stacked up, stacked up, wall to wall, full of larvae, and they will be buried in the substrate, the stuff that they're eating and living in. If you go to where the adults are, there's a room where they're flying around and mating and stuff, and starving to death, unfortunately, in most cases, because the adults are not fed usually.
Yes, so you mentioned insect meal as being the product here. So that's ground up maggots effectively, and then that's been used to create other kinds of foods for humans and animals. Is that correct?
Yeah. So the main product usually is the meal. So that is ground up larvae. Sometimes oil from the insects is a product, and also sometimes frass, which is the excrement and other stuff that's left over. You can try to use it as organic fertilizer. Again, there are a lot of practical problems in actually doing that. But the primary product is generally the meal. Almost none of that is used for human food. Black soldier flies, I think, really are not used for food at all. They're farmed because they have the most efficient feed conversion ratio, and there's some other properties that allow them to do better under farming conditions, basically. Black soldier flies are basically not used for human food at all. Mealworms, a tiny bit, crickets, some. Those are the other two most commonly farmed species. Because of in countries without a tradition of entomophagy, very serious consumer acceptance issues. People, for the most part, don't want to eat insects at all. The rare cases where there are products intended for human consumption, they tend to be not products that would compete with conventional animal products anyway, but rather processed products where you hide the insectness. So pasta, snack bars, cookies, protein powder, that sort of stuff, where often just the conventional alternative would be plant-based and would have a lower environmental impact than if you add in the insects. In countries without a tradition of entomophagy, farmed insects are not used for human food basically at all. In countries with traditions of entomophagy, usually what people have actually been doing historically is not farming insects on like big industrial farms. Mostly what people have eaten is wild caught insects. Maybe those might be gathered opportunistically while you're doing something else outside, and then maybe you eat them or you sell them alongside whatever you're doing. It's not like a primary enterprise. It's not like you have a business dedicated just to producing insects, right? Oftentimes, I mean, catching insects from the wild, if you do it yourself, is free. Whereas the farmed insects can be quite expensive. Often also the insects that do best under farming conditions are not the ones that people prefer to eat. They're not the right species, et cetera. And so even in places where people do eat insects, it's generally not farmed insects. So overwhelmingly, what the insects are used as is premium pet food. So maybe you have a dog or a cat, and they have an allergy to typical food. You've heard that insect farming is more environmentally sustainable or more ethical in some way. Maybe you have ethical qualms about feeding beef to your dog or something. So, you're in the market for some kind of boutique pet food anyway. You're willing to pay more because you love your dog. So you can charge a premium there potentially. So sometimes they're used for premium pet food for dogs and cats. And sometimes they're used as premium feed additives, mostly for farmed fish. Again, there's not a lot of uptake actually in either of those either, and that's why the industry is struggling. The product is pretty expensive. That's really where the environmental questions come in. If you were eating insects instead of conventional farmed animals, that would be better for the environment. Now, it would probably be better still if you just ate lentils or something. That all sources of protein are more sustainable than conventional animal products. Insects aren't unique in that, but they are better than conventional animal products if you're eating them instead of conventional animal products. If you're feeding them to other animals, though, which you're then going to eat the other animal, you run into a problem because the insects in most cases are being fed feed grade materials. sometimes literally commercial animal feed, but often things like wheat bran, cornstarch, things that are agricultural co-products of other processes that usually would be used as feed anyway. Now you're buying those and you're feeding them to the insects, which first of all makes it more expensive, but that also, you're adding a trophic level. You could have just fed that stuff directly to pigs or whatever. Instead, you're feeding it to insects. You also need energy to process the insects, etc. I'm in London right now. It's very nippy. As I said, black soldier flies are tropical insects, so you're going to need to heat the facility. That costs money, that costs energy, unless you can do it all with waste heat. In some cases, there's a lot of water that gets used for like facility hygiene, that sort of stuff. So when you're using them for farmed animal feed, it's actually very unclear. And it depends on the context, but often the environmental impact is going to be potentially much worse than even just conventional animal feed, soy meal or whatever. And if you're using them in pet food, you run into the problem that pet food, of course, largely relies not on meat of the sort that you would buy at the grocery store, but rather various sorts of slaughter byproducts, offcuts, offal, bones, things that have a lower environmental impact. And so there's actually not a lot of research on insect-based pet food, but the research that there is suggests, again, it looks probably worse than conventional pet food, and almost certainly worse than, plant-based pet foods, which are increasingly being developed. I think the one study that provides a figure guesses somewhere between 2 and 10 times the climate change impact for the insect-based pet food, which one thing that tells you is because the range is so big, that illustrates how much uncertainty there is. But it's going to be quite hard when you're purpose rearing an animal to be used in pet food. It's going to be quite hard to compete with other products that are relying largely on byproducts and similar things. And then while I'm on this kick, there also, we talk in the paper, there's kind of another set of potential issues, ecological issues, having to do with escapes and improper disposal of diseased insects. So, you have all these trays stacked floor to ceiling in a big warehouse environment. Some of these farms, if they were operating at full capacity, would be producing well over 1 trillion insects a year. So you have a huge number of animals in a small space. They are vulnerable to disease. Disease outbreaks happen a lot. And so then if either you don't, when you have a disease outbreak, you call them. You can't use them as feed anymore. So you're going to kill them or get rid of them somehow. If they're not properly disposed of, or if diseased insects escape into the wild, there's a risk that they might be able to spread diseases to wild insects. Increasingly, the insects used on farms are selectively bred. In some cases, I'm not sure how much this is actually done in practice, but there is a company that sells a line of genetically modified black soldier flies. And there's gene sequencing that's been done in Europe recently that suggests that insects basically are escaping from farms and then breeding with wild insects, which can be a biodiversity concern. In many areas, the insects that are being farmed either are pest or invasive species. So there's also this other set of risks, again, where there's not a lot of evidence. There hasn't been much research done on them, but there are potential risks to local ecosystems and things, just like when, you have outbreaks of avian flu on a chicken farm and then that spreads to wild birds, or outbreaks of diseases on pig farms. Similar things happen in other kinds of animal farming, and presumably they'll happen increasingly if insect farming takes off.
Yes, that makes a lot of sense. It's interesting that there's this recurring idea when you're speaking of, well, there's not a lot of research on this, or there's a lot of uncertainty about this, or questions remain about this. So given this comparative lack of research, and I guess given that you've just done a review of existing research, you're in a great position to comment on this, why has it really entered the zeitgeist that insect farming is this sustainable option when we're just not really sure about what it looks like?
Yeah, so we had an earlier paper called "Bugs in the System," which sort of was addressing that. So that paper was asking why was the early research so bullish, And, what are the assumptions that haven't held up in practice? The biggest factor was that FAO report. The FAO endorsed insects as food and feed sources. That got a huge amount of media coverage. That's been cited thousands of times. If you go look on Google Scholar or whatever. And there was some other early research also that was very bullish. At the same time, lots of new things, new technologies, whatever. Initially, there's some kind of speculative theory about why this is going to be great. This is going to solve a lot of problems. Then it turns out in practice that it becomes a lot harder. It turns out to be a lot harder than we thought it was going to be. It turns out that it's not a silver bullet that solves all our problems. And sometimes that's because of technical issues. Sometimes that's because of social issues, getting consumers to behave the way that you want them to. And basically, there are a cluster of issues where early research made assumptions which turned out to be overly optimistic. It turns out that they don't reflect what real world, large scale commercial insect farming looks like. So, a big one was the question of what the insects are going to be fed. A lot of the early research was assuming that you could feed them some sort of organic waste or other. You'll feed them food waste, potentially even excrement. And then if you have something that's genuinely waste, like something that's going to rot in a landfill and produce greenhouse gases rotting in the landfill or whatever, and instead you can feed it to the insects, you're turning something that was a liability into something that is economically valuable and is valuable for the food system, is a source of protein, et cetera. It turns out, in fact, that it's very hard to use organic waste, meaning actual waste, not agricultural byproducts like cornstarch or wheat bran, but like actual, food waste or whatever. It's very hard to use that as feed for farmed insects in commercial environments. There are a variety of reasons. One has to do with safety and regulatory issues. Anything that is in what you're feeding them, in principle, could be passed up the food chain if there are heavy metals, if there are pathogens, whatever. And so you need research to determine what the risks of that are, what control measures are. Have you had chain of custody of this thing that you're trying to feed the insects, et cetera? There can be logistical issues. Lots of organic waste in the developed world, at least, is already being used for other things. It's being used for anaerobic digestion or whatever. If you're trying to use something where availability is seasonal, then like what's going to happen during other seasons? What are you going to feed the insects then? If you're using something that's distributed, so like ordinary food waste is spread out all over the place. In many areas, there aren't like separate collection systems just dedicated to the food waste. So like, how are you going to get all this and bring it to your farm? There are nutritional issues. So again, if you think about like ordinary catering waste, first of all, it's going to be less nutritious in many cases than high value feed materials, but it's also not homogenous. So if you're trying to make a deal with Tyson or whatever, some big company that needs a bunch of feed, they need to know exactly what the nutritional content of the feed that you're going to be selling them is, right? They need to know what it is. It needs to be the same every time. It needs to be. And if you're not feeding all of the insects the same thing, and you're not feeding that one batch of insects the same thing as the last batch, then you're going to have variability. And if you have variability, then, well, now the people you're trying to sell to, they're not going to be interested, right? Also, the nutritional quality affects the life cycle of the insects. So you feed them something that's more nutritious, they will grow faster. And then you can slaughter them faster. And then you can produce more in your facility, right? You can produce more batches. If you feed them something that's less valuable as feed, that's less nutritious, then in a way that there's some trade-off where, okay, so that's cheaper, so that's better economically. It's probably better for the environment because there was less other stuff to do with this. At the same time, now you're producing less because it takes longer. Each batch of insects, the other inputs are they're taking more to produce, say, a given kilogram of protein or whatever. And so there's a trade-off between maximizing production and like the other aspects of efficiency and what you are trying to find some low value ingredient that's not useful for other things. So roughly, it turns out there's some correlation. It's not a perfect correlation, but there's some pretty good correlation between the things that make materials good as feed for insects in large-scale commercial environments, and the things that make those same materials good as feed for other animals. And usually, if some source of waste, some organic material, is not being used for other animals as feed, that's because there's something that also would make it not ideal as insect feed. And so in practice, what the large companies do is use these feed materials and add a trophic level to the food chain, which is not efficient. The thing people have heard, I mean, another kind of failed assumption, the thing that everybody heard was, oh, in the future, we're all going to eat crickets, right? Everybody's heard about, and the stat that everybody has heard, thousands of articles about this, is stats comparing insects to the environmental impact of conventional animal products, right? Which that's only a meaningful stat if you're eating them instead of conventional animal products. And I think people early on had just like a very overly optimistic idea about how malleable consumer preferences are and how easy it was going to be to get people in, say, North America and Europe to give up steak for edible insects. I think people should have known, because they should have known that there's been a movement trying to convince people to be vegans and vegetarians for decades. And they have pretty good arguments, right? This is better for the environment. You don't have to, I mean, there are these animals that are mistreated on factory farms. Like, they've gotten a lot of airtime. I mean, often people don't even disagree. Lots of people keep eating meat even though they think, yeah, maybe this is wrong. But the number of vegans and vegetarians is not like growing exponentially. It's kind of stalled out at a pretty low number. If it was enough to just tell people, oh, here's an alternative source of protein that is better for the environment, then the problem would have already been solved, right? We know that's not enough. Getting people to change their day-to-day behavior, very deeply ingrained patterns of eating that are culturally reinforced, et cetera, that's very, very, very hard. It's very hard even with things like plant-based burgers or, plant-based chicken nuggets now, I think, are actually indistinguishable from normal chicken. I mean, they actually taste the same. And, it's still very hard to get people to switch. If you pick something like insects, where, in Western countries, people have very deep disgust associations. And like, you can try to do things to wear away at those slowly over time, give kids in schools a chance to try insects or whatever. But like, it never really made sense to think that the way to do this was going to be to try to get people to eat insects when we have other sources of protein that people are not willing to give up meat for anyway, that are much more palatable to them, right? And that would have a better environmental impact and other impact anyway in a lot of cases. So there also are things like that where there were assumptions about consumer behavior and what the use case was going to be and that sort of stuff that I think probably it should have been obvious in advance that these were not realistic assumptions, but like definitely 10 or 15 years in, it's clear that these were not realistic assumptions. And people in the industry know that. They're not really trying to make human food at this point. That's not a market they're interested in.
Well, this is a good point, I think, to expand the conversation a little bit beyond these environmental concerns, because I know you're executive director of the Insect Institute, which is involved in all kinds of research around insect farming. So I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about the Insect Institute and the kind of work that you do there, but as well, a particular concern of mine, and one that I think a lot of listeners might have been thinking about, something you alluded to earlier. Are insects sentient? Can they feel here? Because if they can, you're talking about trillions of individuals, that was a number you mentioned earlier, who are potentially suffering. This could be a moral disaster.
Yeah. So the Insect Institute, yes, we're a nonprofit organization. We're doing, mostly what we've been doing research on is the stuff about the economics and environmental aspects of the industry. But we've also, I mean, we've said we think that there need to be welfare standards in the industry, and like right now there really aren't. There are probably about 2 trillion insects a year being farmed, and that's at a point when the industry is not doing very well. So if it was doing better, then there would be a lot more, right? It's just insects are very small, so to get any appreciable amount of product, you have to farm a lot of them. It's not clear whether insects are sentient or not. I mean, we don't know. There's controversy. There are reasons to think that they at least might be. So again, in the UK, some invertebrates are recognized as sentient now under the Animal Sentience Act from, 3 years ago. Parliament's recognition of them as sentient was based on this framework, the scientific framework that was developed by the London School of Economics. So there are these 8 criteria. The more that you are known to satisfy, like the more plausible it is that you're sentient, roughly. If you apply those criteria to farmed insects, it looks like they should be considered sentient too, based on what Parliament's already done. So adult black soldier flies are actually known to satisfy more criteria to a higher, very high degree of confidence than true crabs are, more of these criteria for sentience. Larvae, most of the criteria have just never been studied at all. But there's even some, particularly in later stage black soldier fly larvae, there's some decent evidence. I think maybe they're known to satisfy 4 of 8 or something, and the remaining 4, it's just not known. So, we don't know whether they're sentient or not, but they very well might be. I don't know, if you just watch insects outside, it kind of seems like they don't behave just like little robots. It seems like they are making decisions. And so then there's a potential animal welfare concern here. In principle, it could turn out, well, maybe the conditions on farms are just naturally fine because insects, they do well in cramped conditions. And, maybe just the things that when people are maximizing for efficiency in other forms of animal farming, that tends to be very bad for welfare. Oh, could it turn out that's just not the case because, things naturally sort themselves out because insects just like kind of being in these conditions? Unfortunately, it's not so clear that that's true. Like I said, they do have disease outbreaks on farms. Adult black soldier flies, like I said, are generally starved to death. Often, if you ask farmers, often they genuinely believe that they don't need to eat. They think that's why you don't feed them. They just don't eat. We know now that there have been several studies that's not true. If you give them, they don't eat solid food, I think, but if you give them liquid nutrition, they live longer. So they do starve to death if you don't give them any nutrition. And people just don't realize that. And there are a lot of other concerns. And again, in many cases, it's hard enough already to know, okay, what is like a good stocking density for a chicken, right? When you're talking about animals that are even more different from us than a chicken is, what's even harder to know. And often there's been even less research. This is a very new industry. And of course, there are no legal protections in most cases. So that's why I mentioned the RSPCA has expressed concern about this. There's a lot we don't know, both about their capacity to feel pain and about what sorts of conditions would be good or bad for them. But yeah, it does seem like something that needs to be taken into account. It also connects to some of the other concerns. So like I mentioned, there are these other biosecurity and biodiversity concerns that are raised by disease spread. And so that's something where addressing some of the environmental and ecological concerns that like naturally goes hand in hand with addressing some of the welfare concerns that are caused by disease outbreaks, right? I think there's some evidence actually that if you do feed the adults, you get performance increases in some cases. So there might be cases where, oh no, there actually is a natural affinity between what's best for the animal and what's best from an economic perspective. But people just didn't know that because the science wasn't done yet, right? I mean, I think in the UK, I think it's obvious actually that the legal framework should recognize at least some farmed insects as being sentient. And it seems obvious to me that we need more research on the capacity of different insects to feel pain, on the capacity of larvae to feel pain at different life stages, and also on what sorts of welfare standards in practice would be, ideal and realistic and feasible and stuff.
Now, we could talk about this for hours more. I've got lots more questions for you, lots more ideas I wanted to explore, but I'm aware time is ticking away, so I propose we move on to our regular 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
Yes.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
Yeah, I was thinking about that. So the first, I don't think this was the first one I read, but the first one I can remember seriously thinking about was in high school. Somehow or other, I got exposed to some of Peter Singer's stuff, and it specifically was some of the more controversial stuff, where he's drawing a kind of moral equivalence between non-human animals and infants and people with cognitive disabilities and this sort of stuff. And of course, if you're starting out thinking there's this big moral gap between humans and animals, and then you're trying to put animals and some humans on the same level, like you could be raising up the animals or you could be lowering the humans. And like Singer is doing some of both, right? Because it turns out, oh, the animals have this, interest against having us cause serious pain to them that we're not respecting, etc. At the same time, it turns out some of these humans, like it's much easier to justify killing them than we normally thought. And not having a big background in animal studies and whatever, the lowering of the some humans was the thing that really was salient when I learned about this. So I think it actually probably put me off being more pro animal for a couple years because I found I had sort of a negative reaction to it at the time.
Well, that's excellent. That's a similar starting point to a story we often have on knowing animals, but in some ways a different ending. So, can you recall the first piece of pro animal scholarship you ever wrote?
Yeah, I had to look at my CV to remember the answer to this. So the first thing that I wrote about animals was this very odd paper. It was called The Problem of Evil and the Suffering of Creeping Things. So this, as you mentioned, I also have this interest in philosophy of religion. It was making the argument that, it's possible that invertebrates, including insects and like other, mites, other little things, it's possible that they might be able to feel pain. And if they can, there are certain ways in which this makes the problem of evil harder to solve. And philosophers of religion should be paying more attention to this fact and thinking more about these sorts of creatures.
If you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
I think maybe Oscar Horta, because he was the first. We've been talking about some of these ethical issues around invertebrate sentience and stuff. He was the first person who I read actually take that seriously and mention, like, by the way, there's so many invertebrates. This point you made, like if you're talking about trillions of animals, that could be really important. And so I read, he has this paper about wild animals, but he just briefly talks about invertebrates at the end. And that was the first time I had ever really thought about that. And then I thought, like, yeah, actually, this seems like an important issue and people don't care about it very much.
What do you think is the most important thing that academics can do for animals?
I was thinking about this. So, I'm speaking here from thinking about my time in the academy as like a philosopher. This may be less applicable, say, to people in the natural sciences or something, but I think there's sometimes a tendency to treat doing research on an important topic as like the end, right? So I've written about something about how we should treat animals, and like I think I figured out the right answer, and I came up with a good argument for it, and I got it published in a peer-reviewed journal, and oh look, it's been cited, and like my colleagues, it's giving me prestige, whatever. Like that's, and you think like, great, I did it, and that's sort of what you're taught to do, and that is what gets you prestige. That's what gets you professional success. But like doing all that is completely compatible with having had no impact at all, right? It's possible what happens is a couple other academics read it, they think, oh yeah, great paper, you affect their views, nothing in the world changes, they get cited a couple times. So I think the thing that I would like academics to do more is think about execution. Like, okay, you've done this research, it has some conclusion that is interesting, whether it's to policymakers or the public or whoever. They don't know about it, right? Just because you published it in a journal, like it's not going to affect anything. So we need to think more about how to actually translate all the academic research into real world impact.
And if you had the power to change one thing about the human non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
I read this question yesterday. I wouldn't know where to start, Josh. I guess, I mean, the thing that's relevant to what we've been talking about, of course, is that yeah, I think that there should be like more research on invertebrate welfare and sentience, and we need to move towards like actual baseline protections for them. if I literally could pick anything, would that be the thing I would pick? I don't know, but that's the thing that's relevant to what we've been talking about, I guess.
Yes, it's such an enormous question. It's hard to know where to even start. I agree. So perhaps some slightly easier, more down-to-earth questions. What are you working on next?
Yeah, unfortunately, that's also not an easy question, because the thing is that we've this paper that we've been talking about is the culmination of this cycle of 5 papers that I and the same co-authors had worked on, and we got the drafts, we've been sending them through peer review, whatever. So like now that research cycle has culminated. You breathe. Now you sort of think about your priorities. Okay, what should we work on next? And that's where I am right now. Okay, we got it. It's out. What should we work on next? Yeah, I'm not sure yet. So I don't know.
How can people find out more about your work? And I will add the work of the Insect Institute as well.
We have a website. It's insectinstitute.org. It will come up if you Google it. So we have like a newsletter that you can sign up for. We have a news and blog section that we don't update as much as we might. We're on LinkedIn, so you can follow us on LinkedIn. You can follow me on LinkedIn, some other social media sites. I have a personal website, dustincrummett.com, that I also do not update very much.
Yes, I know that feeling. There's only so many hours in the day. Well, thanks so much, Dustin, for joining us for this podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And thank you, listeners, for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. You can follow us on X or on Facebook, and you can find me on X or on Instagram. I'm on Blue Sky. I'm also on LinkedIn, but I don't actually update it. But you are welcome to connect with me there too if you like. My name's Josh Milburn, and I do like knowing animals.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.